To find the location of Plato's Atlantis is very straightforward. All you have to do is follow the directions that Plato gave. Now the problem with this is that most people making documentaries, especially from Europe or from USA, do not want to follow the directions that Plato gave. It might take them to an unsuitable place. So instead, they make documentaries promoting Atlantis as being, for example, in Cyprus, or in Thera, which is Santorini, or Crete, maybe Malta, maybe Sardinia. Most certainly the south of Spain is very popular recently, and even the Eye of the Sahara has become popular recently, thanks to some videos by somebody on YouTube mostly. But these locations do not correspond to what Plato said. In other words, they either change the words of Plato, or they just completely ignore them to make it fit in somewhere which is acceptable to the people making the video, and probably more acceptable to their audience too. But we can go back to the origin of the story with Plato, and we can look at what Plato said, and we can actually find the location of Atlantis which fits the description of Plato using only 3 steps or 3 directions. The first and major direction is that Atlantis was an island, and it was located in the Atlantic Ocean. It was said to be larger than Libya and Asia together, meaning North Africa, and Asia meaning kind of the Near East in the time of Plato. So a very, very large area. And an island that size in the Atlantic Ocean certainly rules out Santorini, it rules out the south of Spain, and it rules out the Eye of the Sahara. But there is an island in the Atlantic Ocean which fits the description of Plato, and that island today is called South America. But we must remember or realize that America is not the original name of this continent. America is a modern, or fairly recent, should we say, European name imposed on the continent at the time of its discovery. And it was discovered by Christopher Columbus. It was not discovered by Amerigo Vespucci. But the name Atlantis, or should we say Atlantis, is a better name because Atlantis comprises 2 Native American words, atl, which means water, and antis, which means copper, as in Antisuyu, the kingdom of the Antis, as it was called at the time of the Incas. So, if Atlantis is to be South America, how come hasn't it disappeared beneath the water, which, as Plato said, it disappeared in a single day and night of earthquakes and floods? Well, the reason is surprisingly simple, because Plato, one moment he is describing at the beginning this vast island continent in the Atlantic Ocean, which is called Atlantis, and the next moment he is describing a small volcanic island with concentric rings of land and water. And that is the Atlantis, which is sunk in the space of a single day and night. In fact, in the beginning, the early translations didn't call it Atlantis at all. They called it the Atlantic Island. So if we stick to the original, which is called the Atlantic Island, it's a bit ridiculous to try and say that it would be a small island in the Eastern Mediterranean. So step 1 is that the island larger than Libya and Asia together is now called South America. Step 2, perhaps the most important point of Plato's description, is that Atlantis was located on a smooth and level rectangular shaped plain. He even tells us the location. He says it's midway along the longest coastline of the whole island. So if we go to a modern map of South America and we look midway along the longest coastline, we can find, yes, there is indeed a level rectangular plain, and today it's called the Altiplano. Plato even tells us a surprising detail, that the plain was located high above sea level. That means high above the level of the Pacific Ocean, the ocean sea. He also tells us that it was surrounded by mountains. Therefore, the illustrations you see in, for example, classical textbooks of a plain open to the sea on the south side is incorrect, because Plato said it was high above sea level and enclosed by mountains. And that is a perfect description of what today is called the Bolivian Altiplano. The third step or direction is that Plato tells us in the center of this level rectangular shaped plain there was a mountain which was low on all sides. And this mountain became the home of the original god, who was called Poseidon. Poseidon is the god of the sea, but he's also the god of earthquakes. And this mountain had concentric rings of land and water and was destroyed by earthquakes and floods in a single day. And we can visit today the remains of this mountain, and we find it has been destroyed by earthquakes and floods. It was submerged beneath the sea, that is to say, an inland sea, which is called Lake Popo, and remains of deposits from the original prehistoric sea can be found around lower levels of the mountain. So here we have a place that fits in every way and every description, but European video makers and American video makers, they don't want to know anything about it. And in fact, my videos, which I made, were removed by YouTube. Was it so important to remove my little videos showing that Atlantis is in America? Well, apparently for them it was very important, and I was told I was not allowed to make any more comments. Thank you very much, YouTube. Now, we can go on and talk about the points of the description of Plato. Around 2005, there was a conference in Milos in Greece, and they produced a list of 24 points which a site supposedly going to be Atlantis ought to have. They were a bit jumbled up and hard to understand, so I refined them a little bit, and I added more points to make a total of 50 points that the site called Atlantis could have, because the site in Bolivia has about 50 points that correspond to what Plato actually said. I won't go into every single point here because it would take too long, but main points were, for example, the metals, gold, silver, copper, tin, and the mystery metal called orichalcum are all to be found on the edge of a lake around Lake Popo, and orichalcum is a mixture of gold and copper. It was called by the Spaniards tumbaga, and they found plenty of it. They thought it was gold, and when they melted it down they found it was gold and copper. There are other small details, like the first inhabitants were born in pairs. This is also part of an Inca legend. Hot and cold springs, animals, horses, and elephants. Well, recently they found in some cave paintings drawings of horses and elephants, that is to say mastodons, going back around 12,000 years. So all the time the history of South America is opening up to us. Well, quite a few years ago, on one of my trips to the pass in Bolivia, I was walking around a second-hand bookshop stall area in city centre, and I saw hanging up a very colourful booklet with somebody paddling along on a reed boat. So I picked up this copy of this pamphlet booklet thing and opened it up. On the first page, here was a very curious illustration. It was a picture of a city on the edge of a lake, and it said, oh, in the beginning, well, at that time, all the people lived in wonderful happiness. And then I read a bit further on, and it said, oh, the people had lost their divine ways and became very bad, and therefore they were punished by the god, and the city sank beneath the sea, beneath the waves, beneath the lake. And I thought, this is very strange, because this is what Plato said about Atlantis. Whoever published this booklet, had they been reading Plato's Atlantis? Or was it a truly Bolivian history, legend, story? Well, as it turns out, this version was a version published by very well-known Bolivian writer and scholar Villamil de Rada. And in it, he talks about this god called Pachacamac. Well, Pachacamac is the Inca name for the god who in Aymara, which is further to the south of Bolivia, is called Tunupa. And the Tunupa is set adrift on a reed boat, travels down this river Desguadero, which means the drain, and disappears beneath the sea or the lake at the very site of Pampayagas, which is the site of Atlantis. Now, in the Quechua, which is the language of the Incas, in this version, the Pachacamac, he founded the city on the edge of a lake, and then they saw how the people had fallen into bad ways, and he went down to try and persuade them to better their behavior, amend their ways, but they knocked him on the head and they cast him adrift on the reed boat. And when the reed boat wandered around the lake for a while, it eventually struck against the southern shore of the lake and opened up this river Desguadero. Before that time, there was no river Desguadero because the altiplano was perfectly level. So some event happened and the southern part of the altiplano dropped in elevation, so that today we have the river Desguadero. So all that water would have rushed down, including perhaps floodwaters from further north, where they have lakes full of melted glaciator water, which according to Poznański all gathered together and fell into each other and called this kind of torrent of water, which today we would maybe call a tsunami. And we could say that destroyed the city site or the mountain site at Pampayagas, which is said to be destroyed by earthquakes and floods. Now, here's a curious aspect of this story, that Pachacamac, amongst being a god of various other things, he was also the god of earthquakes. And the name in Poseidon was the Greek name, and Poseidon is well known as the god of the sea. But Poseidon is also the god of earthquakes. And Poseidon founded the city of Atlantis, in which his son out of 10 sons, Atlas, inherited, and so forth. We get the name of Atlantis. So here we have clearly, I think, the origin of Plato's story of Atlantis. And some aspects may be difficult to understand. For example, Plato talked about sacrifice of bulls. Well, Plato also said all the names were translated into Greek to make it familiar to his readers. And there was no word in Greek or Egyptian, where the story is said to come from, for the animal called llama. So they used the word bull. But if we look at the ceremonies that they have in Peru and Bolivia, it is very clear that Plato is talking about this ceremony, but used the word bull instead of llama. And other aspects, such as, for example, the war between the Atlanteans and the Eastern Mediterranean, is actually a description of the wars, as recorded by Herodotus, between the Persians and the Greeks. And this began, according to Herodotus, with the attack of the Greeks on Troy, which is actually an invasion of the Asian mainland. And later the Greeks created states, city-states on the Asian mainland. And the Persians remembered this, and several centuries later They gathered together a vast armament, including 1,200 ships, which is the same number that Plato gave, and they attacked Athens, destroyed the capital. But around 480 BC, the Athenians destroyed the Persian fleet at the Battle of Salamis, and then the Greeks invaded Persia and destroyed the Persian Empire. So the whole story has got elements which we can track down. Well, most of them. So there we have the origin of Plato's story in Peru and Bolivia with the legend of the Desaguadero. And people have actually been diving beneath this lake, which is called today Lake Winnemarca, which means the Eternal City. And they found remains of constructions and temples and things submerged beneath the lake. So the legend of the Desaguadero has, in fact, although it's a legend, has a true origin. So the difficult thing, of course, at the moment is how Plato got the information, what parts are true, what parts may have been mixed up, because the legend refers to a city on the lake Winnemarca, which is the southern part of Lake Titicaca. But Plato's description refers to the rectangular plain which is next to Lake Popo, or as it used to be called, Lake Auyagas. And it is there at Lake Popo, the southern end, we found the mountain with the remains of the concentric rings of land and water. And the southern part of the mountain has completely disappeared beneath the ground. So it is very clear there was a great destruction there. And it was at a time when there was a much higher level of sea or lake, so the water could have entered the rings. But today the lake has dried up and the site is now available to inspect on dry land. In the year 2000, I returned to Bolivia and participated in the film with the Discovery Channel, and that was the first time I had personally visited this site at Pampiagas. Cerro Pedro Santos Vilca is the original name. Well, it's not the original name, it's the Spanish name, or the local people gave it to afterwards. It has an original name, which is not that one. It's quite complicated. Anyway, I went back there, particularly based on some information I received from Bolivian Carlos Aliaga, who lived in Cochabamba. And sometime before that, I had stayed with him in his house as a guest in Cochabamba. And we had gone on an expedition to Santuario de Quillacas, which is at the south end of Lake Popo. We saw this mountain in the distance. There was not too much time. I had to come back to England. So another day he went back and had a look and sent me a report about it. So I visited it the first time. That was in about the year 2000. Then in the year 2004, I think it was, I sent a team of 3 Bolivian boys, Luis Gutierrez, Miri Vargas, who was an anthropologist, and Andros Vega. I sent them back to have a look at the mountain and told them to look for any cat stones. Well, they found plenty of cat stones and sent me a report all about it. And they even mentioned how strange is it that we can find stones, cat stones on this mountain, which are covered in fossilized lake deposits and go back thousands upon thousands of years. When I told them to show them to the local archaeologists, they were kind of laughed at and ridiculed, and their material was ignored. And here are a few quick snapshots of the various stones that were found by Team Lama on the mountain Cerro Pedro Santos Vilca, which exists at the side of the village called Pampa Llagas, which is at the southern end of Lake Popo, and most of the stones have been completely shattered by earthquakes, and others disappeared under the ground. Then, maybe a couple of years ago, a local comunario, as I call the people who live in the villages, He sent me a video, well, he actually posted it on YouTube. He discovered a large block of stone digging up the ground which he found at the base of the volcano. That was actually the second stone, because years before his father had found a cubic kind of stone, large stone block, which he'd taken home. So last year I went back to Bolivia again, and we went to the site accompanied by a team of people, including the local newspaper editor Carlos Bedregal, and dug up a stone to show me, because an unknown archaeological stone buried beneath the ground, which nobody knows of, is no use to anybody, but it seems to be that's what the archaeologists preferred. So we documented this stone. That was successful expedition in my view, and I came back to Europe.
Mi papá encontró cantorito, encontró.
¿De oro?
No sé, no sé entre si tendría oro, no sé. Aquí el divacio está deteriorado aquí, ¿no?
Está bien, a ver, tratamos, ¿verdad?
Nunca he llegado hasta ¿dónde hay cavado? He excavado ya, pero no he encontrado. Se esconde, ¿sabes por qué? Es lo mismo que
A ver. No. Es de una palanca.
A ver, vamos a ver.
Ni ahí. A ver.
¿Sabes qué voy a necesitar ahí?
Que la ponga
Una vez que
ahí.
levantemos, una vez que se levante, le tiran la piedra abajo, ¿vale? Este otro lado.
¿Hace cuánto tiempo habían encontrado esto?
Más de 20 años tiene.
Antes de que yo llegue.
Antes.
After a while, my associate Liz Usteres of the Hostal Graciela participated with the people of the village and surrounding area, preparing the way to repair and open a museum to the Atlantis at the village site in Pampayagas. Now, investigating the villages round about, she found a site full of stones, and these stones out there in the desert were called piedras arrastradas. That means dragged stones. And they say they were dragged there by the force of water from a great tsunami which hit the volcano. So there's our missing stones, beneath the ground and lying out there in the desert. And at another site she went to, she found a whole lot of beautifully cut stones. These were stones brought from the mountain at Pampayagas, and they were used as the foundations for a church. So well done, Liz, and thanks for your good job. I'll wrap up this filming for the moment and see if I can put together a whole bunch of illustrations to fill it out and make it into a new documentary, or I'll attempt to post it again on YouTube and at the same time on Facebook. So for any of you who is really interested in the original story of Atlantis and want to know where the site is, Bolivia wants to develop its tourism industry. So the site exists. You can buy a copy of Plato, you can read what Plato actually wrote for himself, and you can see how well the site compares. Of course, Plato was not writing a historical document. He was talking about the ideal form of government for an ancient Athens. So there are aspects which do not correspond, and there are other aspects which are not fully understood. Like any modern writer, Plato had sources. He had the source of the story which came from Egypt, he claimed, and he also talked about a war between the people of Atlantis and the people of the Eastern Mediterranean. And I think for that war, he's using the story by Herodotus of how the Persians invaded Greece and attacked and burned down Athens. But in the end, they were defeated, actually centuries later, by the Athenians in a great sea battle at Salamis. So all these little details can be tracked down and identified. Now, over to you.
Jim, you're in hiding camera.
Oh, great. Have a look at this.
Okay, Jim. Liz, you too.
Hola, hola.
Hola, hola.
Aquí identificando el
Okay,
próximo
here
lugar.
Gualberto de Tipaya, allá Demetrio y atrás dos reporteras de la patria, la AA, Aleida y Alicia y Daniel Bedregal. Okay.